Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking time and joining us today in spite of this wonderful weather and Saturday afternoon. Yeah. I know we're all tired, so I hope we will keep your attention. My name is Mira Milosevic. I am the Executive Director of the Global Forum for Media Development. We are a network of around 200 organizations around the world who work to support journalists, journalism organizations, and media development organizations in over 70 countries. Today, we will aim to address at least some of the issues and some of the impact that this information that we are seeing around the world has on human rights. We will talk about, among other things, freedom of expression, privacy, rights of assembly, and some other issues. We will be talking about roles of platforms, what governance and civil society organizations are doing to ensure that human rights online are protected, especially when addressing disinformation, and how all these different actors are performing right now. So it's a great pleasure to introduce three speakers today. Karolina Rossini is the director of RightsCon, for those of you who don't know. It's Access Now Conference on Digital Rights, and this year it will be happening in Tunisia in June. If you haven't been, I recommend it warmly. She used to be a policy manager at Facebook, so she knows what she's talking about when she talks about big tech. She also worked at Public Knowledge and Electronic Frontier Foundation, and is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Another fantastic lady, Courtney Radsch, from Committee for Protection of Journalists. She's their advocacy director, working with UN processes, Internet Governance Forum, and leading all CPJ campaigns. She's one of the leading global speakers on global press freedom and freedom of expression issues. She recently wrote a book about cyber activism and citizen journalism in Egypt. And finally, Alexandre Alaphilippe, Executive Director at EU DisinfoLab. He set up DisinfoLab in 2017 to specifically look at problems, impact, and solutions to disinformation in Europe, and is one of the leading European experts and advocates in this area. So we will talk first about what do you see as the major impact on human rights when we talk about disinformation. Karolina, would you like to start first? We'll try to keep our contributions up to 3 minutes, and then we will go to two other questions, and we hope to leave enough time to have a lively discussion with all these lovely people who joined us today.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much, everybody, to be here. It is a wonderful day outside, so thank you for joining us. So one of the initial motivations behind having this panel in Perugia was actually to really try to bring together communities that are siloed from each other. And when we are siloed and not working together, this is dangerous because the same issues are being dealt with and regulated in different fora with different words, but at the same time, they affect all of us in our daily lives and professions. I'm a lawyer, has a background, so if I get too boring, you guys are welcome to boo me. But I'm trying to bridge the journalism community with the digital rights and lawyers, activists from around the world, and we do come together at RightsCon every year to really say, let's keep an eye on it because your careers are being impacted every day with what's going on. And you probably learned already in a lot of other panels that disinformation, and I use specifically the word disinformation, I really want to try to get far from fake news for various reasons. It's not a modern practice, right? Of course, with the internet and the low cost barriers to entry, transaction cost, and the network effects of the internet, the potential of disinformation grow exponentially, and the impacts also grew exponentially. So that's what's extremely dangerous nowadays. And when you forget that actually in the legal community and the freedom of expression community, we are working on this for decades. I started working on internet issues back in '96. We were saying, like, don't bring liability and don't put some pressures in platforms because they are cost averse and they're gonna shut down everything, right? They're gonna take out your content. And that has been a fight that's been happening at the national level. I'm from Brazil originally, so you guys have heard about Marco Civil. It has happened at the UN level. It has happened at the World Trade Association organization level, all the levels you can think. And has also happened in the trade agreements fora, which is one of the least transparent venues for advocates and human rights advocates to work in, because you cannot actually access the negotiation. And in that fora, you keep an eye whenever you hear the phrasing information flow, you are talking about data and content. So you are talking about freedom of expression, privacy, and data protection. So I really think it's important for us match-make that vocabulary to understand how our rights are being affected. So, and it's easy for governments, specifically not so democratic governments, and even my country is going to that direction, to really respond quickly, right? You have misguided politicians or politicians representing serious agendas, politicians that very rarely understand the technology behind things, and that really try to respond because of populist demands and so on, right? It took us like 5-7 years to get the Marco Civil right with a lot of fights and a lot of groundwork and leadership work. But what governments are doing now, they are saying, oh, it's fake news, let's cut it out, let's shut down. And this is happening in a variety of countries that I'm gonna talk about later, but I just wanna make sure that this really has chilling effects, not only for people in general, but also for journalists. Governments are choosing which, governments are choosing which media channels are legitimate, and really shut down a lot of sites. So if you see what's happening in Africa, in Asia, at Access Now, we do have a project within a coalition on shutdowns. If you see the shutdown of sites increasing around elections, so we are also working on that. If you're interested, let me know, because we really need the new voices to fortify that advocacy work. So of course, the first right that is affected is freedom of expression, exactly because of all of what I said. And besides the government action has a response on regulation side, you also have the company's response. And that's because the basic business models behind that is advertisement, right? It's exactly what Mira was saying in the beginning. And advertisement is getting further and further down in microdata through micro-targeting and all the algorithms that are being developed based on that. So it's really easy to do advertisement based on micro-target, which a lot of us human rights advocates consider surveillance in some cases, to really spread that disinformation in a way that causes impact. So if you saw in the US, the Mueller report just came out, and a lot of things came out actually proving the impact of that micro-targeting of content and advertisement. And it's the same thing, right? If you see what appears in a Google search, if I do the same Google search as Mira, the results will be different. If we open the same Facebook timeline, the results and advertisement will be different, right? And you have to also pay attention to your phone. A lot of times you don't realize, if you realize that your picture sometimes when you post online, they say Perugia, Italy, and you said, how does the phone and my picture knows? It's because all the localization is on, and we forgot to turn it off because it's not something automatic we do when you buy a phone, right? So it's there everywhere, and if we don't proactively pay attention to that, the micro-targeting will grab you no matter what. So I think I just want to give this general, this panoramic view. We are trying to work with companies and governments to find new business models that depart from micro-targeting and advertisement, but that's still a big road to go.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Before we continue, how many of you have worked before digital? How many of you have worked in an analog space? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, it's interesting. When digital was just emerging, we were thinking, oh great, all the government censorship, all the pressures, media capture, stifling freedom of expression, this digital environment will bring us more freedom, more spaces. We will be able to publish and to reach audiences that we haven't been reaching before. However, we are now seeing that there is a flip side of the coin, and that the digital spaces have brought new sets of problems. And Alexandre is looking at all these problems and observing what is happening in Europe in terms of disinformation. What is, you think, the largest impact of different disinformation campaigns on our freedoms?
Yeah, I think disinformation campaigns have a lot of an impact, not only on society itself, but only on people who are trying to research disinformation and trying to understand what's going on. Right now, I think the main thing which is really good about disinformation is that we try and we are beginning to bring different expertise to find disinformation. We understand that journalism is very important in trying to understand the phenomena, but the more we need social research, we need computational research, we need psychology, we need lawyers, and we need to understand also advertisement, data science. So there are a lot of expertise that are needed around this information. And the thing is, with having all civil society trying to get into that space, trying to work together on finding new issues, on trying to find patterns, on trying to create awareness, we see at the same time that unlike journalists that have been, let's say, for the good and the bad, used to sometimes being challenged, and I think harassment of journalism is getting more and more there. We also see that now people that are working with journalists or working on this issue are more and more harassed, because once you are working against propaganda machines, when you're working against and trying to uncover disinformation networks or advertisement networks that are spreading disinformation, then you are basically becoming on the target list of these people who are very often very well organized, or in their groups that can be very effective both on harassing you online, harassing you offline. And I think we have a few examples around us. I think in Italy, fact-checker David Puente has been victim of a lot of smear campaigns against himself for some of the work he's been doing. We have someone who will be at our conference at the end of May in Brussels, who is a survivor of the Bataclan attack in Paris, one of the terrorist attacks, like a citizen who, once he get out of the room surviving, he discovered that people created fake accounts using his name, and then people attacking him on other platforms, saying to him that the attacks never existed and he was a spy, and trying to censor and silence him just because he wanted to explain what happened and what he survived. So I think, and we see a lot of NGOs, even in democratic spaces, that are more and more attacked, because the playbook is very the same, trying to look at who funds you and that you don't have any independence, etc. So there is a huge work around undermining the credibility of civil society right now. And this can happen because we are living in an ecosystem, and I think Karolina talked about it, where we have less and less trust within each other. And I think that's the main issue about this. And I'm very happy to be here at Perugia because I can meet a lot of journalists. But if you're not a journalist, ask your family, ask your friends, how many times did they talk to a journalist in their life? They have absolutely, there are a lot of fantasies because we don't meet journalists very often in the normal people's life. So I think we need to to understand this, because this is, for me, the main issue. The main issue around disinformation is try to undermine, to destroy the trust between everyone. And when I say everyone, I would say journalists, fact-checkers, academics, and also include the state, the politicians, and the private companies. We all have work to do to rebuild trust. And this is a work that's going to take years, but if we don't start it right now, it's going to be very, very challenging times, because once you don't trust anyone online or offline, you are subject to the last emotion that can be brought to you. And these kind of tools are very good to play with your emotions. So we need to, I don't say we need to destroy all of these, but we need to train our brains at least to get away 30 seconds from the screen when we see something, trying to plug in the rationality back, and trying to understand who do we trust, and to start rebuilding this trust.
Thank you very much, Alex. Courtney, how is freedom of expression affected by both trends in digital and disinformation, and how much is our freedom of expression community prepared to identify and respond to all these challenges, and how difficult it is to, as Karolina pointed out, be in all these different multi-stakeholder, multinational debates and impact maybe the conversation and hopefully decision-making processes.
Okay, just a few simple questions to answer. Thank you. So I'm also a journalist by background, and I think the thing that really strikes me about disinformation is that it truly is a double-edged sword. So disinformation is undermining press freedom and the safety of journalists through coordinated campaigns that are often done at the behest of or inspired by states or governments or those in political power. And we see those across political systems, obviously in more repressive and closed regimes such as Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, to name just a few of a handful of many, many, but also in democratic countries such as the United States. And we can see that the disinformation campaigns are targeting journalists and targeting media outlets in part as an attempt to undermine journalism, to undermine its function in democracy, undermine its role as a public service, and to delegitimize journalists themselves. The reason I'm saying it's a double-edged sword is because also the responses to disinformation can also have a negative impact on press freedom and on freedom of expression. I think that your question about how prepared is the community, also how prepared are lawmakers and legislators to deal with this issue. And I really think that we are unprepared. I think that we are looking at this entirely the wrong way. Right now, we are having lots of debates about how should disinformation be regulated, what can be done to combat disinformation. So maybe just to take one step back, the Committee to Protect Journalists systematically tracks the number of journalists killed and imprisoned around the world. Over the past 3 years, we've seen a significant rise in the number of journalists who are imprisoned on false news charges. So in 2016, there were 2 countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, that were imprisoning journalists. I think there were 11 of them imprisoned on false news charges. Sorry, 9. Now we've seen that number triple, and we've seen the number of countries using those laws expand to at least 6, and that's just who we're imprisoning on December 1st at our census. And we've seen proposals and legislative initiatives around the world, from Malaysia to Cambodia to Singapore to Nigeria, I believe. There are just a proliferation of efforts to combat fake news, disinformation, and to legislate, and it's often around content. It's looking at things like, what is the content? Is the content true? Is it factual? There's all these fact-checking initiatives, which are interesting, although it's also interesting that when Facebook did its experiment about putting a notation on what appeared to be, false news stories, it actually increased the sharing of those stories. So I think there's the assumption that, if you just have the facts, then we'll be okay, is kind of missing the point. So I think that we need to actually completely reframe how we're thinking about this issue. We're having a question, should the platforms be regulated as publishers or not? What is their role and responsibility? That's a good question, and Karolina mentioned advertisement. But I want to throw out there the idea that we should be thinking about how to regulate tech platforms as extractive industries. So what they are doing is creating and extracting data. If we can rethink about how we approach this, we might be able to get at better solutions so that we're not trying to regulate content and ideas, but we are actually looking at how are they able to create new forms of data and aggregate and collect and pinpoint that data. Is it really so important that you never get an advertisement that you don't want? Does it really matter if maybe, you got an ad for blue jeans and you're really looking for a shirt? We are trading away all of our rights so that we can have better ads. This, I think, we need to really get to the fundamentals. I think that, if we look at the human rights community with the extractive industries, there are frameworks that the oil industries, that diamond mining companies, et cetera, adhere to. And we're able to have those conversations in a way that I don't think we're at yet on this issue. And I think that if we're looking at, is the community prepared? No. Because we're talking about, should Facebook allow this piece of content or not? And if we're truly going to get at the root of disinformation campaigns are about targeting individuals, manipulating their emotions and their perspectives, and being able to do that in a very sophisticated, focused way. I think we also need to look at the nexus of elections, online harassment, and disinformation campaigns, because we're seeing that's really where journalists particularly are at great risk, and where democracies in general are facing great risk. And of course, if you're not a democracy and you're trying to have elections, it's an even more challenging condition. And when we talk about, you asked about the debates and trying to be present in these multi-stakeholder debates and inputs, I think the challenge for journalists is, if you are at a conference or trying to follow a UN process, which could literally take your entire 24 hours of your day and you'll barely, make a dent in it, then what you're not doing is journalism, right? And it's the journalism that has really helped us understand what was happening on a lot of these disinformation campaigns and what's happening around elections. I think the research that is being done at the deep level is very important. But most of what we've known about what has happened, about the targeted disinformation campaigns, about online harassment, about the targeting of journalists with surveillance, for example, is because journalists reported on it. That then puts it onto the public agenda, that then puts it onto the researchers' agenda, it then puts it onto the policymakers' agenda. So we also need to be thinking about how can we empower journalists to do what they do best, which is journalism. So I think we really need to rethink and reframe how we get at this debate, because it's very challenging to talk about. We end up tying ourselves in knots as a freedom of expression community, trying to figure out what the platform should do. Do we want government regulation? We've got the NetzDG in Germany, which, I think there was a lot of real concern about these broad categories of criminal content, having no judicial oversight, asking the companies themselves to decide what is legal and what is illegal without that judicial input, having no remedy and no transparency over the data set of what is the content that is deemed illegal, having no judicial review. You then cannot train the algorithm to better spot that. So there are huge holes, in a lot of these approaches. But at the same time, if we're still looking at it from a content perspective, we're tying ourselves in knots, trying to not restrict the type of information such as the Syrian archive or a lot of the Syrian domestic media and citizen journalist outlets that have been taken offline, had their videos removed from YouTube because they were caught up in one aspect of the tech company's attempt to restrict a certain type of content online. The whole countering violent extremism debate and how do we get terrorist material offline had a huge impact on news media. So as long as we're approaching this from a speech and content perspective, I don't have a lot of hope.
Thank you very much. That was a great point, and we had this morning a discussion about are we addressing consequences only, or is there a way to look at causes of all of this? So Karolina, when speaking of causes, and Courtney, you mentioned data and how the data mining is actually happening. Karolina, how do we look at what tech companies and the governments are doing when most of it is opaque at the moment? What are the entry points to see how we can address these things?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very important question. And one of the things I want to mention here and always relate back to the purpose of this panel, I think Courtney and Alex brought a couple of things that are extremely important. And if you go to the human rights narrative and vocabulary like I was talking about, we are talking about freedom of expression, we are talking about privacy and data protection, but we are also talking about the right of assembly, right? We cannot forget the right of assembly. The right of assembly is one of the counterstones of our democracy and also a lot of the civil rights movement in the US and so forth and so on. So I just want to make sure I bring that because there are specialized courts around the world that actually can support us to deal when those rights are affected. So I'm always thinking about, okay, what are all the venues to deal with issues? We have the bad venue, which is the governments responding quickly to a phenomena, which is the fake news disinformation. You have the companies also responding quickly, and I'm going to give examples. But we also have the mid-long-term solutions. The good solutions take time because they are more complex, or they take a couple of years through an international court or like the international criminal court or things like that. That take years, but they are extremely relevant for it to go on.
Do you think that the approach that big tech platforms are taking to address misinformation is a good approach at the moment?
I personally don't, because I agree with Courtney. I think they are addressing through the content venue and not through the privacy venue, because of course it's a way to distract us, right? If data is in the core of their business model, they don't want people paying attention to how they do data algorithm and things like that. So what happened recently, right? And I'm vocally critical about that. So for example, in content moderation issues, Facebook decided to create this group, and just like FYI, I was not in the content or privacy policy team, I was in the access and connectivity team, created this outside board to help with content moderation that also impacts disinformation and hate speech and other things, right? It's all about which content they take down or not. This is very dangerous, it's very distracting, because besides distracting from the privacy discussion, they are actually putting in an outside body the liability for how they deal with content, right? It's a smart move, and people need to understand that they are pushing outside their own liability, right? And I would be very careful with those outside councils and boards and advisory boards companies are forming on content moderation. I really think, again, if we don't pay attention to the words, we get the wrong things. And in terms of governments, I'm very worried, and I'm very worried for a lot of journalists in this country. So you have new legislation combating fake news in Egypt, which actually criminalize fake news and folks behind it, both who does it and who spreads it. You have Bangladesh, who besides criminalizing also is literally taking entire media outlets out of the air. You have India, which released in December a consultation, private consultation just with platforms on also how to deal with this. And again, always through the angle of content and not how the information gets spread based on data and micro-targeting. You have Malaysia that just entered in effect like a year ago. And you also have a lot of countries negotiating. Brazil right now, they are actually discussing criminalization of the same behavior. So this is just an overview, but I also, I want to point that the good solution is the long-term solution, which is like figure out how we're going to deal, what are the new business models, or how to explore less those resources. There is a discussion, again, I will not bore you, happy to discuss later, on treating data as property, and that's really dangerous too, happy to discuss that later. But there is an important notion of data has not just mapping your behavior, but also actually you as a person, your preferences, and et cetera, et cetera. So how can we actually filter how deep that data is used and when, and what is your whole and right, give informed consent, and saying what part of my data you can use at a certain point, right? So where is that process there? So there is a lot of discussion actually happening on the health data side, but that discussion has not happened yet on the consumer side. Well, in Europe a little bit, but we are moving in the right direction there. Thank you.
Alex, if you don't mind, I'll skip to Courtney first with a question on some of the examples of what states are doing to address the misinformation by regulating, as you said, false news, some of the examples, and also how they interact with big tech companies, and how does that then impact both freedom of expression and freedom of journalists to do their work.
Sure. So I think we've seen, for example, in Europe, this effort to prevent the circulation, regulate through prevention of the circulation of certain types of content, disinformation, terrorist content, et cetera. It started with a call to take down that content within 24 hours, and then it was 2 hours, and now it's a preventative. It's saying, we want you to develop algorithms that will prevent this content from even being uploaded. I think that causes great concern because, again, if you go to the idea that how can an algorithm spot and determine context, how can it see that this video is a news video versus a part of a disinformation campaign, right? An algorithm cannot do that. And so this idea, I think, by regulators that there is a quick fix technological solution is problematic. It could also serve to further entrench a few major dominant players in the field because they have the technical capacity to develop very sophisticated systems to create, the hash databases that then, a hash database is basically a digital fingerprint for a type of image or a video that can say, okay, this has been flagged as illegal content or terrorist content or disinformation content, and then shared in a database with other companies. And if you're a small company, you're probably not going to make those individual determinations. You're just going to go with whatever the big platforms decided. So this has a lot of concerning, I think, implications for this. On the other hand, I think we're seeing that a lot of legislators, for example, in the United States, lack the real knowledge about how these technology platforms work. And when they brought, for example, Mark Zuckerberg up before Congress, I was kind of disappointed in the ability of my senators to ask intelligent questions about what the actual issues at hand were. I mean, the fact that they were asking how Facebook makes money, and it was a one-word answer, advertising, and there was no follow-up, meaningful follow-up to that. I think the British Parliament did a better job. But we're also seeing that in countries around the world, like Vietnam, wants to have the right to take down content and to take down accounts and to have sovereignty over the online space the way that it does in the offline space. In case anyone doesn't know, Vietnam is one of the most repressive and censored countries in the world and has very minimal independent press and regularly throws its independent bloggers in jail. Similarly, we're seeing around the world that there are these efforts to a few different things, to create legislation that restricts false news, disinformation. Second, that there are attempts to require data localization so that any of the data on users in those services is located in a country, and then those authorities can gain access to it. So this is obviously very concerning in countries like Egypt, where you have false news criminalized. It's actually illegal to publish terrorist statistics that disagree with the Minister of Interior, so you can be a criminal if you do that in Egypt. I think that, the amount of data that is being collected on these platforms we have to really think about the data localization issue. On the other hand, I think it's even broader than that, because we have to ask whether we're going to be able to even do journalism in the future if we continue on the path that we're down. I'm just going to be provocative here, but if one of the principles of journalism is that you can protect your sources and that you can have confidential sources, are we going to be able to even have anonymity or guarantee our sources some level of confidentiality with the rapid datification of every single thing in our life? Right? We're not only talking about Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Amazon and those guys. We're talking about your Fitbit, your camera, your clothing, your refrigerator, your toaster. We may not even be having choices about whether our devices are internet connected. My colleague Jim Risen from the New York Times was subpoenaed to reveal his confidential source for a book he wrote about CIA basically screwing up an operation. And they ended up not needing his testimony because they got enough different data pieces that they convinced a judge that they had found the leaker. So I think we have to think about this, yes, in terms of the platforms of dissemination that we're talking about, the social media companies, but it is also a much broader topic than that. And you mentioned freedom of assembly, freedom of association. If we're wearing all of these data producing devices, giving our children dolls and toys that record their voices and learn from them. There was a doll outlawed recently in Germany that did that. We're not even going to be able to do anything without creating data that can then potentially be accessed.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the audience, Alex, there is a big amount of things being said in relation to election and disinformation. But there are some activities by civil society organizations to address, for instance, the problem of targeted advertising. I can mention Ranking Digital Rights, and Mozilla recently published a call. Could you say something more about it?
There is an open letter from Mozilla from, I think, early this week, trying to ask for having more transparency on political advertisement and to ask to the platforms what data would be needed by researchers and journalists to actually research and track disinformation campaign using advertisement. And I think that's a good step of building cross-expertise together and to have one voice to ask things, because in the past 2 years we heard a lot like we need more transparency, but not being able to define what kind of transparency, what kind of thing we wanted to have. And I think it's a very good first step to have like a very concrete ask and question to say like we want these and we want these in that format, because that's the first step we will need. I would also like to come back on the regulation part, because I think, and it's very, very difficult for democratic societies to regulate this, but I think the more we're trying to mix illegal content, which is like racial hate and that kind of things, with disinformation, the worse it's going to be, because we are trying to mix different things together. There are things that are illegal, already in the law, and we just need to apply the law for these things online. There is no difference between online and offline. And I think the more we are trying to create fake news law, the worse is it going to be. But there are different approaches. I think right now nobody's talking about having a resilience fund, for instance. There is no support either from the state or from civil society to help civil society to be resilient against disinformation. I think there should be a common approach about, at the same time, media literacy, protecting sources for journalists, enabling whistleblowers to have an activity. And I think all of these parts is not addressed at all, and we have some initiative, but we should have money coming into this, because when things arrive and you don't know and you don't have a lawyer and you don't have these kind of things, it's a nightmare. And I've lived through this, and I can do it. It's a nightmare. You don't know where to look at and you don't know how to do. So I think there should be a resilience fund. I think also we need to be careful of, in the way we are processing this question, I think we have we are assisting life to a hijack of language. I think we know exactly in this room what freedom of expression means. I think if you run a study around fringe communities, for some of them, freedom of expression is being able to be racist or anti-Semitic online. And this is freedom of expression for them. So I think we need to be very, very strong about this, because the more we are trying to mix things, the more we are entering this narrative where we're trying to shut down voices. And at the same time, we say, like, people in non-democratic countries should have their voice heard, but we cannot shut down voices and ask for other voices to be heard. So I think we need to be really cautious about this. Another thing is, there was one idea, and I'm always super sad talking about this. We worked with the Belgian government for a few months to have a model of a civil society council on disinformation, which were bringing both journalists, both academics, media literacy initiatives together with a 1.5 million euro fund to grant projects for cross-expertise. Unfortunately, because it's Belgium, the government collapsed 2 days before we could vote this at the parliament. But I think it was a great idea for the first time to bring this kind of thing together and to give money for doing this. And I think this should happen in many, many countries, because I think it's one of the key. And then last thing, because I just had an idea looking at you, and we have a lawyer here, and we have people I know, specialists of internet regulation. I have a question, because I just had this idea. So, Facebook and other platforms were created for people to exchange information. Okay. Right now, I was saying yesterday that we are witnessing that more and more they're not like interpersonal platforms, but they are more acting like a distribution platform. So they're basically distributing content for everyone, for companies, for media, etc., etc. So maybe they are not platform communication, but more like a distribution of news and of content. So can we say that, because on the internet we have this, data is data, so basically a tweet equal a PhD, and a book equal a news article. Can we imagine some way of making advertisement more expensive for things that are very cheap to make, like cheap collage, cheap photomontage, and to ease the distribution on very high quality content?
Oh, so actually there's some, I can't remember which group it is, but I just heard a proposal that a group is saying about having an advertising tax, so that if you are using the platforms to do targeted advertising, you're going to pay a greater tax, and then that could be fed back into the news industry. And I think, you know, some of these responses to disinformation, what should we do about it? I think we do need creative responses, but I think there's also like a really straightforward thing, which is more local journalism. So if we had, you know, we've seen the decimation of local journalism around the world, the economic model, the sustainability has always been challenging in some countries. In other countries, like in the US, we just had more than 1,000 reporters laid off over the period of a couple weeks at a variety of news organizations. And I think that if you had more beat reporting, more reporting on what's happening in the local community, you would know more journalists. And journalism, fact-based, you know, journalism is a certain type of communication, is an antidote in and of itself to disinformation. But it's funny, I rarely hear policymakers or funders talking about just funding good old-fashioned journalism, especially if it doesn't have the word innovative in it.
Yes.
You know, but there's something to be said for just sending a reporter to the court every day to report on what's going on.
Thank you very much. Not to go into those details, there were 2 sessions this morning, and a good thing about the festival is that they record all the sessions. So if you have time, take a look at something that happened at 10 o'clock this morning called Nutrition Labels for News. How can standards help our media ecosystem? That's in line with Alex's idea and what Courtney was saying. And there was another one that I participated in on media capture in the digital age, talking about the advertising system and how that kind of fuels the machine of data harvesting and selling it for advertising. That responded to some of these questions. Now, to you, to open the floor for questions and comments for, I think we have 10 minutes, and then maybe we can make a couple of closing remarks. Anyone? Yes, go ahead.
Microphone. Sorry. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mafalda Avelar. I'm from Portugal. And I've been working as a journalist since ever, especially in Brazil. And now I'm making a 1-year break to be on academic site, just to study data, to have the big sources in the real flow. And my question is the following. What are you doing in Africa? We are speaking about a country where, a continent where some countries don't use skip because they don't have washer machines. So this is to tell you, and on the other hand, we are speaking about a country with a huge level of penetration of cellular phones. And actually, in some countries they don't have banks, but people receive the money and they do all these things with the money. This tells that in somehow they are one step ahead of us. So I would like to know what is your strategy about this emerging market that will have a huge impact, not only in Europe, but all over in terms of balance of powers in the world. And my second question is actually you answer, is what are you doing in terms of giving an incentive to journalists to be more in a room with academics? Because if we really want big data and good data, we have to look to the source. And if we are speaking about the good academy, it means that the good academy are in a land, are not in an office. So these are my 2 questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we can all respond, but just a couple of sentences so that we can, yes.
So on the Africa side, it's interesting to see that a lot of the big platforms take much longer to launch the products in Africa exactly because the advertisers are not there. So that means that you have this gigantic pot of data to be harvested that is being harvested by the cell phone companies, but not so much used by the advertisement if you compare to other countries. But that can give us a good opportunity, right? So one of the things we do a good opportunity and a bad opportunity, because one of the things that's happening is that actually quickly, because of fake news debate, a lot of African countries are issuing these legislations on fake news to cut things. But instead of just taking a certain content, they are taking the whole thing. So if you see numbers of shutdown of websites and media outlets, it's gigantic. Another thing you are seeing more and more is shutdown around elections. So one of the things that Access now is doing within a coalition is actually let's bring some stakeholders to the table before elections to say what will be their rules on data use and content moderation and shutdown before elections, so you actually avoid shutdowns during elections. And there is a whole working group on that, a whole international coalition on that. So that's, I think, a little bit on the... It's very sad that a lot of times, because of a lot of African countries are less democratic, the bad legislation tends to catch up much quicker than the good long-term solutions. So on the Africa side, that's right.
Thank you, Karolina. Alex?
Maybe on the second question, because I don't work at all on the African continent, so I don't have anything to say. On the second thing, I think for many years, journalists and academics were not used to work together. I have the enormous chance to be in a European project with both academics and journalists in the project and tech companies, and I think it brings a lot of value. And I think we should maybe we should force at some point, we should give incentive for academic plus journalist cooperations on developing new tools or trying to see what kind of effect we have on some reporting, etc. There are many things, but for now, I think because of methodology, because of also, let's say, time, which is sometimes needed to academics to start a new thing, and because of lack of funding in both sectors, I think they are not. It's not a priority for everyone, and I think that's a shame, because I think they should join forces like on a daily basis, basically.
I would just add to that I think also the incentive structures don't necessarily align for academics and journalists to work together. So I did a PhD, that's what my book is based on. If you're trying to get an academic job, they do not care as part of your tenure application about anything to do with journalism, about your public policy work. It's all about your peer-reviewed published papers. So the incentive structure for academics is not necessarily there. Similarly, I work in journalism, and almost everyone at the Committee to Direct Journalists is a journalist. And there's, I think, a lot of, there's not necessarily an interest always by journalists to take the time, to do the rigor of academia, and they don't necessarily see the policy relevance or all of that. But of course, journalists regularly interview academics as experts. But I think there's a lot more that could be done there. And in terms of Africa, one of the things that we're doing right now actually is my colleague, I believe, is on her way or already in South Africa, which is about to have elections. We know that online harassment is likely to increase and to become an issue, so we're trying to get out ahead of that. And we've also applied for election observer status so that we can be on the ground, seeing what's happening and working with journalists. And we have a security specialist on the ground so that we can help proactively help journalists think about their safety and how can they report on these issues. This isn't really related to disinformation per se, but again, I think there is a nexus between the online harassment issue and the disinformation issue. But I also think it's very challenging because it's very hard in many places in Africa to gain access. So for example, Eritrea, basically a black hole. Tanzania, when my colleagues went there, they got detained overnight and then kicked out when they were trying to get a sense of the information environment. So, when you have a lot of restrictions on access, on information, on independent media, of course, it's going to be, easier for state capture or for disinformation campaigns to take hold.
And in addition to that, what I want to mention is that at Access Now we have this security helpline. And why I'm bringing that, because it was very interesting to see, especially during elections, and it's a 24/7 global network, and we have a coalition of federated support. And like a couple of years ago when it launched, it was just 100 of asks for help. Now it's a couple of hundreds per week, especially when you have elections. And a lot of the ask for help are from journalists, exactly because they are being targeted, there is cyber attacks, their accounts have been compromised, their Facebook, their Twitter, so we help them walk back and really understand how, and train them how to protect themselves and really clean their stuff quickly, right? Because that actually can threaten lives. A lot of things happen, and even to localize somebody, that person is there and then that person is attacked. So how can you protect yourself? Can you protect your sources? And let's not enter in quantum computing, which is coming, and anonymity is done. So we're going to have to go back to the analog. But I think that's it's a way that we are here to serve the community. And Courtney said in the beginning, journalists need to be journalists, right? So let's figure out who is who in the community and help each other, because we all have different expertises. And by knowing how we can connect the silos, we can be stronger, right? I don't need to be a journalist to work with journalists, and you guys don't need to be a lawyer to work with lawyers, right? So let's work together.
And also there are conferences like this one, like RightsCon, like World Press Freedom Day organized by UNESCO, and others that are open and accessible to all journalists. And they bring a lot of academics. There is also something called International Academic Communications and Media Research Network, and they have their annual conference every year. This year it will be in Madrid, and I think it's a good idea to suggest to them to bring more journalists to report on what the latest research from all over the world is saying. Any other questions? I have a couple, but I think we need to yes, wrap up. We didn't speak much about solutions. So just quickly, a couple of main points on what are the next steps that need to be taken, both by governments and private companies, and also civil society, and what do you think would be some of the examples of good solutions?
I think that there are, like, I like to look at a problem as a value chain of pieces, or since we are in Italy, has a salami, right? Let's cut the salami in pieces and solve problem piece by piece. And I think there are both immediate solutions, like we all need to know how to protect ourselves better and understand what our data contribute. The value of our data individually is actually not much at all. If, like, it's less than $50 your, like, tax ID in the US, so that's not what worth for people. What worth is the collectiveness of data. So can we think about data based on the models of a trust or the commons, right? So it's another proposal different from the extractivist industry analogy. And like there is a Nobel Prize on economy thinking about the commons. How can we treat data commons and really develop it in a trust, and how you access and use that trust in a way that benefits the community that holds the trust. So I really think we need to go to have our focus on the privacy regulation and data regulation and how the business models impact that. So I think there is nothing else there that would solve the real cause of the issue.
Thank you, Karolina.
I would say to, learn to protect ourselves, and including data and resilience against harassment and kind of pressure that can arrive with the internet, to not mix illegal content and disinformation, and to try to support financially and with organization with any possibility cross-expertise platforms on disinformation in every country and even in every community. I think that would be very helpful.
And one clarification, when I said trust, it's not trust in the sentiment, it's actually trust, like if you think about the old style land trust. So just to make sure about the concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some solutions implied throughout, but just to go out and weed out some of those, some is fund local journalism and find sustainable models, which may mean, maybe there are ways to tax or claw back some of the advertising revenue from the platforms, which has really undermined the economic model of journalism, at least in countries where there was already sustainable journalism, though we know from GFMD that there are already challenges in many countries with even sustainability in that sense. I think also any current regulation that is imposed on tech companies that requires any sort of content takedown needs to have a few key principles in place. Transparency. They need to make sure that the data set of content that is taken down is available, to either judicial oversight, if it's because it's taken down because it's illegal. Let's have an assessment made so that can be fed back into the algorithm and improve the machine learning. Let's also have that data set available to independent researchers, journalists, and others who want to be able to report on those issues. We can look at data protection, privacy, and ephemerality. There's no reason that we need to have data around forever and ever and ever. So thinking about that. And making sure that there is remedy for these, for content when it's taken down under these mechanisms, and that it's meaningful remedy. Because I've never actually met a journalist or an activist who has successfully used an automated button to get any sort of recourse from Facebook or Twitter or Google.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear your opinions, and thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.